Imagine for a moment that you are standing at the port of Lisbon on a March morning in 1498. The smell of salted fish mixes with the aroma of spices from distant lands, while sailors with faces weathered by sun and salt prepare for a journey that could last months or forever. Have you ever wondered what went through these men's minds as they looked toward the endless horizon, knowing they might never see their families again? The truth is that life during the Age of Discovery was a fascinating blend of rampant ambition and absolute terror. But what was it really like to live in that era of exploration? What motivated thousands of men to leave everything they knew behind, to venture into unknown seas, facing storms, disease, and the constant threat of death? The answer isn't as simple as history books often make it seem. There was something deeper happening in the 15th and 16th centuries, something that transformed ordinary men into explorers, willing to risk everything. Was it gold, spices, glory? Or was there a more primitive, more human drive pushing them into the unknown? Let's start at the beginning, but not the obvious one. Forget for a moment the dates and famous names. Think of João, a 28-year-old fisherman living in a small Portuguese coastal village. His life was predictable, waking before dawn, going fishing with his father and younger brother, returning at dusk with whatever they managed to catch. He had married young, had 3 small children, and lived in a modest stone house. His existence followed the same rhythm for generations, but then came the news. Men who had left on expeditions returned rich, telling stories of lands where gold sprang from the ground and where a single voyage could turn a peasant into a landowner. João heard these stories in the local tavern, seeing the sparkle in the storyteller's eyes, feeling something stir inside him. But were these stories true, and if so, what was the real cost of that wealth? The truth is that behind the romance of discovery, there was a brutal and well-organized system. The expeditions were not romantic adventures led by brave heroes. They were calculated commercial ventures, financed by wealthy merchants and the crown itself, where every man aboard had a specific role and where the hierarchy was as rigid as iron. Think about it. You are on a 20-meter wooden ship, squeezed together with 40 or 50 other men, sailing for months through oceans no one had fully mapped. No GPS, no radio, no rescue system. If something goes wrong, you are completely alone. How did these men cope with constant fear? How did they maintain their sanity in such extreme conditions? The routine on board was the only thing that kept them functioning as a unit. They woke before dawn to the sound of the ship's bell. The most experienced sailors checked the sails, the ropes, the condition of the vessel. The cabin boys, usually boys between 12 and 16, cleaned the deck, organized supplies, helped in the kitchen. But can you imagine what it meant to be a 14-year-old boy, far from home for the first time, facing storms that made the ship rock, like a toy in the hands of a giant? Food was another constant challenge. In the first days of the voyage, there was still fresh meat, soft bread, fruit. But soon that turned into salted meat as hard as stone, biscuits infested with worms, water that tasted like rotten wood. Scurvy, a disease caused by lack of vitamin C, was so common that experienced sailors recognized its first signs: swollen gums, loosening teeth, wounds that wouldn't heal. How many men died simply because they didn't know they needed to? Eat fresh fruit? But there was something even more disturbing than hunger or disease: psychological isolation. Imagine going months without seeing land, surrounded only by the infinite blue of the ocean. No news from home, no knowing if your family was well, no knowing if you yourself would survive the journey. Some men began having visions, others talked. To themselves, others became violent. How did captains handle psychotic outbreaks at sea? The answer was brutal discipline. On a ship, the captain's word was absolute law. Disobedience could result in public whipping. Desertion, when possible, was punished by death. Mutiny was the gravest crime, punished not only by execution but by public torture to serve as an example. Fear kept order, but also eroded men's morale day after day. And the storms? The storms were events that turned grown men into terrified children. Imagine 15-meter-high waves crashing against your wooden ship, winds howling like demons, rain soaking to the bone. During a storm, there were no atheists aboard. All prayed, regardless of their faith. But prayed to whom? To the Christian God who had sent them on this mission? To the ancient sea gods their grandparents still whispered about? Or to any higher power that might hear them? Navigators developed curious rituals to deal with these extreme situations. They carried amulets, followed rigid superstitions, created elaborate ceremonies when crossing certain latitudes. The famous equator baptism was not just a joke. It was an important psychological ritual marking the transition from a known world to a completely unknown one. Why did these men, many educated and rational by the standards of their time, cling so strongly to superstitions? The answer lay in the human need for control. When you can't control storms, winds, ocean currents, or diseases, you need to find something you can control. Rituals, superstitions, prayers, all gave sailors the illusion that they had some power over their fate. But what about when they reached unknown lands? You might imagine it would be a moment of relief and celebration, right? The reality was very different. After months at sea, the men were weak, sick, mentally exhausted. And then they encountered peoples completely different, with cultures they could not understand, in environments that could be hostile in ways they never imagined. Think of the first meeting between a Portuguese sailor and a Native American in 1500. Two human beings, but from worlds so different, they could be from different planets. The Portuguese, pale from time at sea, wearing heavy clothes even in the tropical heat, carrying metal weapons the native had never seen. The native, with bronze skin, adornments telling the story of his tribe, deep knowledge of the land the Portuguese had just discovered. How did these two worlds communicate? How was trust established, or more often, how did conflicts arise? Body language became crucial. A misunderstood gesture could lead to war. A rejected offering could mean a deadly insult. The most experienced navigators learned the importance of interpreters, often castaways from previous expeditions who had survived and learned local languages. But how many cultural misunderstandings resulted in unnecessary violence? How many opportunities for peaceful trade were lost due to mutual ignorance? And here we come to one of the darkest parts of this story. What happened when explorers realized they could take by force what they could not obtain through trade? The transformation from explorer to conqueror did not happen overnight. It was a gradual process fueled by greed, fear, and the perception of technological superiority. A merchant who had left Lisbon to trade mirrors for gold would find himself months later leading attacks against entire villages. How did this transformation occur in the minds of these men? How did they justify to themselves actions that back home would be considered heinous crimes? The answer was often dehumanization. The peoples they encountered were described as savages, pagans, primitives. This language was not just prejudice, it was a psychological tool necessary for morally conscious men to commit brutal acts. If the other was not fully human, then normal moral rules did not apply. But not all explorers followed this path. There were those who developed genuine relationships with the local peoples, who learned their languages, respected their cultures, and established fair trading partnerships. These men often faced conflicts with their own compatriots, being seen as traitors or weak. Why were some able to maintain their humanity while others completely lost it? The difference often lay in their original motivation. Those who left home mainly driven by curiosity and the desire for knowledge tended to be more respectful of cultural differences. Those motivated purely by greed saw the local peoples as obstacles between themselves and wealth. Speaking of wealth, let's address a frequently romanticized aspect, the return of the navigators. Popular stories tell of heroes returning home laden with gold and spices, received as conquerors. But what was the statistical reality of these expeditions? The brutal truth is that most expeditions were financial failures. For every spectacular success story, there were dozens of ships that never returned, hundreds of men who died far from home, thousands of families left impoverished waiting for husbands and sons who never came back. Investors knew this. They financed multiple expeditions knowing most would fail, betting that some would succeed enough to cover all losses. But what about those who really did come back rich? What was it like to readjust to civilian life after years facing extreme situations? Imagine Joel, our fictional fisherman, returning after 3 years of voyage. He survived storms, diseases, conflicts, saw comrades die, participated in actions he never imagined he was capable of. Now he is back in his village with enough gold to buy land, but with a mind transformed by experiences his neighbors could never understand. Many former navigators suffered from what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. They had nightmares about storms, couldn't sleep in soft beds after years of sleeping in swaying hammocks, felt claustrophobic in closed houses after months under the open sky. Some became alcoholics, others socially isolated themselves, some organized new expeditions just to escape the memories. The wives and children of these men also paid a high price. Imagine being married to someone who left as one person and returned as a completely different one. Children who barely remembered. Their father now had to live with a stranger who insisted on being treated as a paternal figure. Divorce rates were low at the time, not because of marital happiness, but due to social pressure and legal restrictions. And there was another curious phenomenon, the sea calling syndrome. Many navigators, even after traumatic experiences, felt inexplicably drawn back to the ocean. It was as if life on land, no matter how comfortable, seemed too small after having known the vastness of the world. These men organized new expeditions, leaving their families again in an endless search for something they themselves could not define. But let's talk about a frequently overlooked aspect: women during this age of discoveries. Although they rarely went on expeditions, they were fundamental to the entire system's functioning. They kept family businesses running during their husbands' long absences, raised children alone, and made important decisions about investments and properties. Some women became independent merchants, leveraging contacts established by their explorer husbands. Others financed expeditions as silent investors, amassing considerable fortunes. There are even documented cases of women disguising themselves as men to join expeditions, though this was extremely dangerous and punishable by imprisonment or death if discovered. And what about the navigators' daughters? Many married other explorers, perpetuating the cycle. Others became nuns, seeking stability in a world where men were constantly leaving. Some developed their own businesses, especially related to the trade of exotic products brought by expeditions. Urban life in the ports during the Age of Discovery was an explosion of cultures, languages, smells, colors, and sounds. Lisbon, Seville, Amsterdam, London, these cities became cosmopolitan centers where dozens of different languages could be heard in a single afternoon at the market. Spices from India, gold from America, silk from China, perfumes from Arabia, all converged at these meeting points between worlds. But this diversity also created tensions. Different ethnic and religious groups frequently clashed. Prices of exotic goods fluctuated drastically, depending on the success or failure of expeditions, creating instant fortunes and sudden bankruptcies. Crime increased. Newly arrived sailors with pockets full of gold were easy targets for thieves and swindlers. The port taverns became centers of unofficial information. It was there that news about newly discovered routes, lost ships, and investment opportunities were heard. Cartographers sold clandestine maps, former sailors offered their services as guides, merchants negotiated contracts for future expeditions. But how much of this information was true, and how much was exaggeration fueled by alcohol and wishful thinking? Nautical technology evolved rapidly, driven by practical necessity. Compasses became more accurate, astrolabes more sophisticated, maps more detailed. But each technological advance also meant that riskier expeditions became possible. It was a vicious cycle. Better tools allowed people to go farther, but going farther meant facing even greater dangers. And then there was the religious issue, which permeated every aspect of navigation. The Catholic Church saw the expeditions both as opportunities for evangelization and as sources of wealth to fund its activities. But how did sailors reconcile the Christian mission to bring the word of God to the pagans, with the often brutal actions required to conquer territories and extract riches? Many developed a pragmatic form of Christianity, where moral rules applied differently depending on the situation. Stealing from another Christian was a sin, but taking gold from pagans was reclaiming riches that God had destined for the faithful. Killing in war was justifiable, especially if it was against infidels. This moral flexibility was psychologically necessary, but also created deep internal conflicts in many men. The priests accompanying expeditions often found themselves in impossible positions. They had to maintain Christian morals among the men, but also support actions that clearly violated the basic teachings of Christianity. Some became cynical, others fanatical, and others desperately tried to find theological justifications for unjustifiable acts. As decades passed and more expeditions returned, the nature of the voyages changed. The first generations of explorers set out into the completely unknown, but later navigators followed already established routes, stopped at known ports, and traded with peoples already contacted. The era of great discoveries gradually turned into the era of organized colonial trade. This brought profound changes to the lives of sailors. The voyages became more routine but also more specialized. Different types of navigators emerged, explorers still seeking new lands, merchants following established routes, military personnel protecting trade routes, and administrators governing distant colonies. Each type of navigator faced different challenges. Explorers still dealt with total unknowns, but now felt pressure to find something as spectacular as previous discoveries. Merchants had safer trips, but faced fierce competition and shrinking profit margins. The military dealt with constant conflicts, but had a clearer hierarchical structure. Colonial administrators lived in relative comfort, but spent years away from home in culturally isolated environments. And then there were the castaways, a frequently forgotten but numerically significant category. For every ship that returned safely, others were lost in storms, wrecked on unknown reefs, attacked by pirates or hostile tribes. Survivors of these shipwrecks often lived for years in foreign lands before managing to return, if they ever did. These involuntary castaways became unique chroniclers of the era. Forced to live intimately with completely different cultures, they learned languages, customs, and traditions that passing explorers never understood. Some adapted so well that they chose not to return when the opportunity arose. Others became valuable intermediaries, serving as interpreters and negotiators for later expeditions. But what was the psychological impact of living for years knowing you were lost, possibly forever? How did these men maintain hope? How did they cope with the possibility of never seeing their families again? The letters and diaries some managed to preserve reveal a complex range of emotions, despair alternating with acceptance, longing mixed. With adaptation, fear combined with genuine curiosity about new cultures. We have now reached the end of our journey through life during the great navigations. But have we really reached the end? The truth is that this era of discoveries never truly ended. It evolved, transformed, and took new forms. The human impulses that led João, our fictional fisherman, to abandon his safe life to face the unknown still exist today. Only the oceans we cross and the worlds we explore have changed. When you look at modern explorers, astronauts heading into space, scientists traveling to Antarctica, divers descending into ocean depths, don't you see the same impulses? The same mix of curiosity and greed, courage and fear, ambition and despair that motivated navigators of the 15th and 16th centuries. The fundamental difference is that today we better understand the human costs of exploration. We have psychological support systems, communication technology that keeps explorers connected to home, safety protocols developed through centuries of painful experience. But the essential challenges remain the same: how to maintain humanity in extreme situations, how to cope with isolation and fear, how to justify the risks taken. The great navigations taught us that exploration always exacts a price, not only from explorers themselves, but also from their families, the societies they leave behind, and especially the peoples they discover. They showed us both the best and the worst of human nature, our infinite capacity to adapt, and our equally infinite tendency toward cruelty when confronted with the other. Perhaps the most important lesson is that every discovery is also a loss. Every new world explored means an old world ceases to exist. Every discovered culture is also a culture forever transformed by contact. Every treasure brought home represents resources extracted from other peoples and lands. But would it be fair to completely condemn those men and women who lived through this extraordinary era? They were products of their time, operating within the moral and technological limitations of their age, facing challenges that tested the limits of human endurance. Their actions shaped the modern world, for better and for worse. The next time you look at a world map, remember, every line drawn represents the journey of someone like Juan, our fisherman. Every place name marks where someone risked everything for a dream of discovery. Every sea route was charted with blood, sweat, tears, and also with courage, determination, and an irrepressible curiosity about what lay beyond the horizon. Life, during the great navigations, was neither the heroic romance some want to portray, nor just the brutal tragedy others emphasize. It was something more complex, more human, a reflection of our eternal struggle between the known and the unknown, between safety and adventure, between who we are and what we can become when pushed beyond our limits. And that struggle continues, today, in every person who chooses to leave the safety of the familiar to explore uncharted territories, whether on the ocean, in space, in science, in art, or simply within their own soul. Because in the end, the greatest navigation of all may be the one we undertake inside ourselves, discovering what we are truly capable of when faced with the impossible. The sea keeps calling. The question that remains is, are you listening?